Sometimes the things we treasure most are the ones others throw away. Nadine Walker knew this truth better than most, having spent her 42 years finding worth in what the world had forgotten. She lived simply in the Colorado mountains, making ends meet by buying abandoned storage units at monthly auctions. $10 was all she had left when the rusty container at Lot 17 came up for bid. The other folks laughed at her for wanting such obvious junk. Her German Shepherd Ranger had different ideas. The moment she opened that metal door, he started acting strange. Something buried deep in all that dust and clutter caught his attention. He wouldn't stop scratching at an old wooden crate tucked in the corner. What Ranger found inside would connect Nadine to secrets from decades past. Secrets that dangerous men had hidden away for good reason. Secrets that would put her life in danger once word got out. But what could be worth more than gold, yet deadly enough to kill for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Nadine Walker's front porch as she sipped her coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. 2 years had passed since the logging accident that took her husband Marcus, and she'd learned to find comfort in the small rituals that marked her days. The coffee was strong and black, the way he'd taught her to make it during their 15 years together, back when his laughter filled the spaces between these mountains. Ranger lay at her feet, his dark eyes scanning the tree line with the patience of a creature who understood that vigilance was simply part of mountain living. The German Shepherd had been Marcus's dog first, a working animal trained to track and hunt, but grief had bound them together in ways that went deeper than ownership. Now he was her constant companion, her early warning system, and sometimes her only conversation partner for days at a time. The cabin itself told the story of their life together in rough-hewn logs and practical additions. Marcus had built the original structure with his own hands, cutting timber from their 40 acres and fitting each piece with the precision of a man who understood that up here, mistakes could mean the difference between warmth and freezing. The kitchen addition came later, when Nadine's pregnancy had filled them both with hope and plans for the future that never materialized. She'd lost the baby in the 6th month, and they'd never spoken of children again. But the extra room remained, filled now with the detritus of her auction finds. The storage unit auction had been held at Mel's Auto Salvage, a sprawling collection of rusted vehicles and forgotten dreams that sat at the junction of 2 mountain roads. Nadine had arrived early, as was her habit, parking her battered Ford pickup between a pristine SUV and a motorcycle that looked like it had seen better decades. The other bidders were the usual mix of dealers looking for resale items, collectors hunting for specific treasures, and curious locals drawn by the promise of discovering someone else's secrets. Lot 17 had been the last of the day, a corrugated metal container that sat apart from the others, like a forgotten relative at a family gathering. The auctioneer, a thin man named Bobby Hutchins, who'd been running these sales for longer than most people could remember, had barely concealed his skepticism as he gestured toward the unit. "Last one today, folks. Been sitting out here for about 6 months now. Previous owner stopped paying rent. Family couldn't be reached. Starting bid is $5. The other bidders had barely glanced at the rusted exterior before turning their attention to leaving. Nadine had felt that familiar tug of curiosity, the same instinct that had led her to countless discoveries over the years. Sometimes it was a Depression-era glass collection that brought enough to pay her electric bill for 3 months. Sometimes it was nothing more than moldy clothes and broken dreams. But always there was the possibility that someone's cast-off might be exactly what she needed. $10, she'd called out, raising her numbered paddle with the confidence of someone who'd learned to trust her instincts. The scattered laughter from the remaining bidders had stung, but not enough to make her reconsider. Old Pete Harrison, who ran the hardware store in town, had shaken his head with the kind of pitying expression usually reserved for tourists who tried to drive mountain roads in passenger cars. "Nadine, honey, you're throwing good money after bad on that one. Looks like whoever owned it left it open to the weather for months." But Bobby Hutchins had banged his gavel with the finality of a judge passing sentence. "Sold to number 47. You've got 48 hours to clear it out, Nadine." Now, standing in the doorway of that unit with Ranger pressed against her leg, Nadine wondered if Pete had been right. The interior was a chaos of shadows and neglect, boxes stacked against the walls without any apparent organization. The air smelled of dust and old paper, with an underlying scent of something else, something that reminded her of the root cellar behind her grandfather's house, where important things were kept safe from the world above. The wooden crate that had caught Ranger's attention sat in the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of cardboard boxes that had seen better decades. It was old, clearly handmade, with the kind of joinery that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when things were built to last. The wood was dark with age, and iron bands held it together with the authority of something designed to protect its contents from more than just the elements. Ranger's behavior around the crate was unlike anything Nadine had seen from him before. The dog that normally approached new things with calm curiosity was now alert and focused. His ears pricked forward, and his tail held in a position that suggested both excitement and concern. When she tried to move him away to examine other parts of the unit, he'd return to the crate immediately, nose pressed against the wood as if he could smell something that escaped her entirely. The faded photograph had been tucked into a gap between two boards on the side of the crate, protected from the elements but visible to anyone who looked closely enough. The sepia tones and formal poses marked it as being from another century, and the three men standing in front of what appeared to be a mine entrance wore the kind of clothing that suggested hard work and harder lives. On the back, in fading ink that had somehow survived the decades, someone had written, "Jackson Mills Thornton, 1892, partners until the end." The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the kind of script that came from an education that valued permanence over speed. Nadine had studied it for several minutes, trying to imagine the person who'd taken the time to document these three men and their partnership. The photograph itself showed them as serious but not grim, their hands bearing the calluses and stains of men who worked with tools and earth. Nadine's years as a librarian, before she'd married Marcus and moved to the mountains, had taught her to recognize the signs of historical significance. This wasn't just a random photograph. It was documentation, evidence of something that someone had considered important enough to preserve. The fact that it had been kept with whatever was in the wooden crate suggested a connection that went beyond casual friendship. The other contents of the storage unit seemed to support this theory. Scattered among the modern detritus of someone's abandoned life were items that clearly belonged to an earlier era, a pickaxe with a handle worn smooth by countless hands, a leather satchel that still held the faint scent of the oil used to preserve it, books bound in cracked leather with titles that suggested interest in geology and mining techniques. But it was Ranger's continued fixation on the wooden crate that convinced Nadine that whatever secrets the storage unit held, they were concentrated in that single container. The dog had developed what could only be described as a proprietary interest in the crate, positioning himself between it and anyone who might approach. When she'd finally managed to examine it closely, she discovered that the iron bands weren't just decorative. They were functional, designed to keep the crate sealed against more than just casual curiosity. The lock mechanism was old, but sturdy, requiring a key that was nowhere to be found among the scattered contents of the unit. Nadine had considered forcing it open, but something about the care with which it had been constructed made her hesitant to damage what might be an artifact in its own right. Instead, she'd loaded the crate into her truck along with the other items that seemed connected to the three men in the photograph, deciding that further investigation could wait until she was back in the familiar surroundings of her cabin. The drive home had been uneventful, but Nadine couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Twice she'd checked her mirrors, expecting to see another vehicle following at a distance, but the mountain roads remained empty except for the occasional logging truck. Ranger had spent the journey alternating between looking out the rear window at the crate in the truck bed and scanning the road ahead with the kind of alertness that suggested he shared her unease. Back at the cabin, she'd carried the crate into her kitchen and set it on the sturdy oak table that Marcus had built during their first winter together. In the warm light of her home, it looked less mysterious and more like what it probably was, a container that someone had used to store items of personal value. But Ranger's continued interest suggested that there was more to discover, and Nadine had learned, over the years, to trust the instincts of creatures whose senses extended beyond what humans could perceive. The photograph now sat propped against her coffee mug as she finished her morning ritual and considered her next steps. Jackson, Mills, and Thornton, three men whose lives had intersected in 1892, leaving behind enough evidence to suggest that their partnership had been significant enough to document and preserve. The question now was whether that significance was purely historical, or if it had implications that extended into the present day. Ranger's soft whine brought her attention back to the moment. The dog was standing at the kitchen window, his body language suggesting that something had caught his attention outside. Nadine followed his gaze and saw a dark sedan parked at the bottom of her long driveway, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows. In 15 years of mountain living, she'd learned to distinguish between the various types of visitors that might find their way to her remote cabin. This vehicle didn't belong to any of her neighbors, and it certainly wasn't the kind of car that someone would drive up mountain roads for recreational purposes. The fact that it was simply sitting there, making no attempt to approach the house, suggested that its occupants were more interested in observation than conversation. Nadine set down her coffee mug and moved away from the window, her mind already working through the implications of unwanted attention. The storage unit auction had been public, and anyone who'd been paying attention would know that she'd been the successful bidder on Lot 17. If someone had reason to be interested in the contents of that unit, they might very well be interested in having a conversation with her about what she'd found. But as she watched, Ranger's continued vigilance and considered the careful way the wooden crate had been sealed and preserved, Nadine began to suspect that whatever conversation these visitors might want to have, it wouldn't be the kind that ended with polite handshakes and friendly farewells. The dark sedan remained at the bottom of her driveway for exactly 17 minutes before, pulling away without its occupants ever making contact. Nadine had counted every minute, watching from behind her kitchen curtains while Ranger maintained his vigilant post by the window. When the vehicle finally disappeared around the bend in the mountain road, she felt no relief, only the growing certainty that this was the beginning of something rather than the end. With the immediate threat gone, Nadine turned her attention back to the wooden crate that dominated her kitchen table. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated details she'd missed the previous evening. The joinery was indeed masterful, each corner fitted with the precision of someone who understood that this container would need to survive more than casual handling. But it was the small imperfections that caught her attention now, tiny scratches in the wood that looked deliberate, almost like marks someone might make to indicate a hidden mechanism. Ranger had resumed his position beside the table, his nose working the air around the crate with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he could detect something she couldn't. Nadine had lived with working dogs long enough to understand that their senses often revealed information that human investigation missed entirely. If Ranger believed there was something significant about this particular container, She was inclined to trust his judgment. The breakthrough came when she ran her fingers along what appeared to be a decorative groove near the base of the crate. What she'd initially taken for craftsmanship revealed itself to be functional when her fingernail caught on a small wooden tab that moved when pressed. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was enough to suggest that the crate held more secrets than its locked exterior indicated. Working methodically, Nadine discovered that several of the apparent decorative elements were actually components of a hidden mechanism. When manipulated in the correct sequence, they caused a section of the crate's bottom to slide away, revealing a compartment that had been completely invisible from the outside. The engineering was sophisticated enough to suggest that whoever had built this container understood the value of keeping certain things truly hidden. Inside the secret compartment lay a leather-bound journal, its cover darkened with age but still intact. The leather had been treated with oils that had preserved it through decades of storage, and when Nadine carefully opened it to the first page, the ink was still legible despite its obvious age. The handwriting was the same careful script she'd seen on the back of the photograph, and the first entry was dated April 15th, 1892. "We have made the discovery that will change everything," the entry began. "What started as a survey of mineral rights in the basin has revealed deposits that exceed our most optimistic projections. Jackson believes we have found the source of the placer gold that has been washing down from the high country for decades. Mills agrees that we must proceed with absolute caution. There are already rumors that the Blackwater Company has been watching our movements." Nadine settled into her kitchen chair and continued reading, aware that Ranger had positioned himself where he could watch both her and the windows simultaneously. The journal entries painted a picture of three men who had stumbled onto something far more significant than they'd initially realized. Jackson appeared to be the technical expert, able to read the geological signs that indicated major mineral deposits. Mills was described as having connections in the territorial government, someone who understood the legal complexities of mining claims. Thornton seemed to be the practical one, responsible for equipment and logistics, but as the entries progressed through the spring and summer of 1892, it became clear that their discovery had attracted attention from people who had their own ideas about who should benefit from mineral wealth in the territory. The Blackwater Company was mentioned repeatedly, always in terms that suggested an organization that was willing to use methods beyond simple business. Competition. Mills reports that Blackwater has been making inquiries about our claims. Read an entry from June. They have apparently been told that 3 independent prospectors have been filing papers on sections that Blackwater had intended to acquire through their usual methods. Mills believes that Blackwater's usual methods include intimidation and worse, though he is careful not to make direct accusations without proof. The middle sections of the journal detailed increasingly sophisticated efforts to document their discoveries while avoiding detection by Blackwater's representatives. The 3 men had developed elaborate systems for moving equipment and samples, using routes that avoided the main trails and meeting places that were known only to them. They had also begun to compile evidence of Blackwater's illegal activities, hoping to build a case that would protect not only their own claims, but also those of other independent prospectors who had been driven away by intimidation. But it was the final entries that made Nadine understand why someone might still be interested in this journal more than a century after it was written. In September of 1892, the 3 men had apparently discovered something that went far beyond mineral wealth. They had uncovered evidence that Blackwater was operating as part of a larger conspiracy that included territorial officials and federal representatives who were supposed to be protecting legitimate mining interests. "We now have proof that Governor Harrison's mining commissioner has been taking payments from Blackwater in exchange for advance information about claim filings." Read an entry from September 15th. "They have been using this information to file competing claims on properties that independent prospectors have already surveyed. In some cases, they have been able to have the original claims declared invalid on technical grounds that were provided to them by the Commissioner's office. The implications were staggering. What Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had discovered was evidence of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. They had documented not only the bribes and illegal claim transfers, but also instances where Blackwater had used violence against prospectors who refused to sell their claims at below-market prices. The final entry in the journal was dated October 3rd, 1892, and its tone was markedly different from the earlier entries. Where the previous writing had been methodical and optimistic, this final passage carried an undercurrent of fear that was impossible to miss. Mills believes we are being watched constantly now. Yesterday, Thornton found tracks around his camp that belonged to horses shod in town, not the kind of animals that prospectors would use in the high country. We have decided that it is no longer safe to continue our work in the open. The evidence we have gathered must be protected, even if it means abandoning our claims temporarily. Mills has suggested a hiding place where our documentation can remain safe until circumstances change. We will cache everything tomorrow and then separate until the danger passes. Below this entry, in different ink that suggested it had been added later, someone had written a single line. They found us anyway. God forgive me for what I must do. Nadine closed the journal carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she considered the implications of what she'd just read. These weren't just the records of 3 prospectors who'd made a lucky strike. They were the testimonies of men who'd uncovered a conspiracy that had apparently cost them their lives. The fact that the journal had been preserved so carefully suggested that at least one of them had survived long enough to hide the evidence they'd gathered. But if that was true, then somewhere in these mountains there was still a cache containing proof of crimes that had been committed more than a century ago. And if someone was still interested enough in those crimes to be watching her cabin, then the implications of Jackson, Mills, and Thornton's discovery reached far beyond historical curiosity. The ringing of her telephone broke the silence that had settled over the kitchen like a weight. Nadine looked at the old rotary phone mounted on her wall, its black bulk a reminder of simpler times when communication required physical connection rather than invisible signals. She rarely received calls, and those she did get were usually from neighbors checking on her welfare, or the occasional telemarketer who'd somehow acquired her number. She let it ring 4 times before answering, using the extra seconds to compose herself and prepare for whatever conversation might be waiting. "Nadine Walker," she said, keeping her voice neutral and professional. "Ms. Walker, good morning. My name is David Chen, and I represent a consortium of investors who are interested in historical artifacts from the Colorado Territory period. I understand you recently acquired some items at a storage auction that might fall into that category." The voice was smooth and professional, with the kind of polish that suggested expensive education and extensive practice in persuasive conversation. But there was something underneath the politeness that reminded Nadine of the carefully worded warning she'd found in Jackson's journal. "I'm not sure what you might have heard, Mr. Chen, but I bought a storage unit full of old junk. Nothing that would interest serious collectors. I think you might be underestimating the historical value of some items. Ms. Walker, artifacts from the mining period can be quite valuable to the right buyers. I'd be happy to drive up and take a look at what you've found. I'm sure we could work out an arrangement that would be beneficial to both of us." The offer was reasonable on its surface, but Nadine found herself thinking about the dark sedan that had been watching her cabin just an hour earlier. The timing seemed more than coincidental, and the polished tone couldn't quite hide the underlying assumption that she would be willing to sell whatever she'd found. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Chen, but I'm not really interested in selling anything right now. I haven't even had time to properly sort through what I bought." There was a pause that lasted just long enough to suggest that her refusal wasn't what he'd expected to hear. "I understand your caution, Ms. Walker, but I think you'll find that our offer is quite generous. Perhaps if I explained the specific items we're interested in, you might reconsider. We're particularly interested in any documents or photographs that might relate to mining operations in the 1890s. The specificity of his request sent a chill down Nadine's spine. This wasn't a general inquiry about historical artifacts. It was a targeted request for exactly the kind of materials she'd found in the wooden crate. The coincidence was too precise to be accidental, which meant that someone had been expecting her to find these items. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen, but like I said, I'm not interested in selling anything right now. If that changes, I'll certainly keep your offer in mind. Ms. Walker, I hope you'll reconsider. Sometimes items that seem historically interesting can actually be quite dangerous to possess. There are legal complications that can arise when documents involve territorial government operations. I'd hate to see you inadvertently become involved in something that could cause you serious problems." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, delivered with the same polished tone that had characterized the entire conversation. Nadine felt Ranger's weight against her leg and realized that the dog had positioned himself between her and the phone, his body language suggesting that he shared her growing unease about this conversation. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Chen, but I think I can manage my own affairs. Have a good day." She hung up before he could respond, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than reassuring. David Chen's call had confirmed her suspicions that the storage unit contents were more significant than she'd initially realized. More importantly, it had revealed that someone was watching her activities closely enough to know exactly what she'd purchased and when. As Nadine looked down at the journal in her hands and considered the implications of Jackson, Mills and Thornton's discoveries, she realized that she was no longer simply dealing with historical curiosity. Whatever secrets these three men had died to protect, they were secrets that someone was still willing to go to, considerable lengths to control. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a stone building that had been constructed during the 1920s with the kind of civic pride that assumed libraries would remain, centers of community life for generations to come. Nadine had spent enough years working in similar institutions to appreciate the solid craftsmanship and thoughtful design that had gone into creating spaces where knowledge could be preserved and shared. The reference section still maintained the hushed atmosphere that marked it as a place where serious research was conducted rather than casual browsing. Martha Kellerman had been the head librarian for 37 years. Long enough to have developed the kind of institutional memory that made her invaluable for anyone researching local history. Nadine had known Martha since her own library days, and she trusted the older woman's discretion enough to seek her help without revealing more than necessary about her reasons for needing information about territorial mining operations. "Nadine, dear, it's been months since I've seen you down here," Martha said, looking up from the catalogue cards she was organizing with the meticulous care that suggested she still preferred traditional systems to computer databases. "What brings you to the reference section on such a beautiful morning?" "I'm doing some research on mining operations in the 1890s, Nadine explained, settling into one of the heavy wooden chairs that flanked Martha's desk. "Specifically, I'm trying to find information about three men named Jackson, Mills, and Thornton who were working claims in this area around 1892. Martha's expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention, the kind of change that suggested she recognized the names from her decades of helping researchers navigate the complexities of local history. "Jackson, Mills, and Thornton," she repeated slowly, reaching for a filing cabinet that contained materials too specialized for general circulation. "Those names come up in connection with one of the most mysterious incidents in our territorial history. They were independent prospectors who disappeared in the autumn of 1892, leaving behind claims that were later absorbed by the Blackwater Mining Company. Nadine felt her pulse quicken as Martha pulled out a manila folder that had clearly seen decades of use. The librarian's careful handling suggested that these documents were both valuable and fragile, the kind of materials that were consulted regularly enough to show wear, but preserved carefully enough to remain legible. The newspaper coverage at the time was quite extensive, Martha continued, opening the folder to reveal photocopies of newspaper pages that had been mounted on acid-free paper for preservation. The three men had been working together for several months, filing claims on adjacent properties in what was then considered marginal territory for mining operations. Their disappearance was particularly puzzling because they seemed to have simply vanished without taking any of their equipment or personal belongings. The newspaper headlines painted a picture of mystery that had captured the public imagination in 1892. Three prospectors vanish from high country claims, read the largest headline, from the October 15th edition of the Millbrook Territorial News. Below it, smaller headlines detailed the discovery of their abandoned camps and the futile search efforts that had been organized by territorial authorities. But it was the editorial coverage that proved most revealing about the political context surrounding their disappearance. An editorial dated October 22nd discussed the unfortunate trend of independent prospectors abandoning legitimate claims in favor of pursuing fantasies of instant wealth in uncharted territories, and the editorial's authors seemed remarkably well informed about the financial struggles that had supposedly driven the three men to abandon their work. Despite the fact that no such struggles had been reported in the news coverage, the editorial coverage seems rather definitive about their motivations, Nadine observed, scanning the carefully preserved pages. Martha nodded with the kind of knowing expression that suggested years of reading between the lines of official accounts. The territorial news was owned by interests that were closely aligned with the territorial government at the time, she explained. Their editorial positions often reflected the preferred interpretation of events rather than independent journalism. It's worth noting that the Blackwater Mining Company was one of their largest advertisers. This detail added another layer to the mystery that Jackson's journal had begun to reveal. If the newspaper coverage had been influenced by the same interests that were supposed to be investigating the disappearance, then the official account of events was likely to be incomplete at best. Martha pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the official seal of the territorial government. The territorial marshal's report on the investigation makes for interesting reading as well. According to Marshal Thompson, the three men had been seen in several mining camps expressing concerns about the legitimacy of their claims. He concluded that they had probably decided to relocate to California, where mining opportunities were considered more promising. Nadine studied the marshal's report, noting the careful language that managed to suggest reasonable explanations for the disappearance without actually providing any evidence to support those explanations. The report mentioned interviews with unnamed sources who claimed to have heard the three men discussing their plans to leave the territory, but it provided no details about when these conversations had taken place or who had participated in them. Were there any family members who disputed this conclusion? Nadine asked, thinking about the careful preservation of Jackson's journal and the photograph that had been kept with it. That's where the story becomes particularly sad, Martha replied, pulling out a final set of documents from the folder. Jackson had a wife and two young children in Denver. Mills was unmarried, but had an elderly mother who depended on him for support. Thornton had recently become engaged to a local schoolteacher. None of them accepted the official explanation for the disappearance, the family correspondence that Martha showed her. It painted a very different picture of the three men than the one presented in the official investigation. Jackson's wife had written repeatedly to territorial authorities, insisting that her husband would never have abandoned his family to pursue speculative mining ventures. Mills's mother had provided detailed testimony about her son's character and his commitment to supporting her financially. Thornton's fiancée had offered evidence that he had been making specific plans for their wedding in the spring of 1893. But perhaps most significantly, the families had hired their own investigator, a former territorial marshal named Samuel Rodriguez, who had conducted an independent inquiry into the disappearance. Rodriguez's report, dated December 1892, reached conclusions that were dramatically different from the official investigation. Rodriguez found evidence that the three men had been threatened repeatedly in the weeks before their disappearance. Martha explained, pointing to specific passages in the investigator's report. He documented instances where their equipment had been tampered with, and their camps had been searched by unknown parties. He also found witnesses who had seen men in Blackwater Company uniforms in the vicinity of the claims on the day the three prospectors were last seen alive. The private investigator's report included a hand-drawn map showing the locations where various pieces of evidence had been discovered. The map was detailed enough to show not only the prospectors' claims, but also the surrounding territory that had later been acquired by Blackwater Mining Company. Nadine studied the map carefully, noting that several of the locations marked by Rodriguez corresponded to areas that were mentioned in Jackson's journal, hidden among the investigators' papers was a surveyor's map that had apparently been overlooked by the official investigation. The map was more detailed than anything Nadine had seen before, showing not only property boundaries, but also topographical features that would have been crucial for understanding the geological potential of the area. What made the map particularly interesting was the series of notations that had been added in pencil, marking specific locations with symbols that weren't explained in any accompanying documentation. Rodriguez believed that the three men had made a significant discovery that someone else wanted to control, Martha said, lowering her voice even though they were alone in the reference section. His report suggests that they were murdered for their knowledge of mineral deposits that were later developed by Blackwater into some of the most profitable mining operations in the territory. The implications were staggering, but they aligned perfectly with what Nadine had read in Jackson's journal. The three men hadn't simply stumbled onto valuable mining claims. They had discovered a systematic conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Their disappearance hadn't been the result of personal decisions or business failures. It had been the result of their refusal to participate in corruption that was apparently widespread and profitable. What happened to Rodriguez? Nadine asked, suspecting that an investigator who had uncovered this much information might have faced consequences for his discoveries. Martha's expression grew somber as she pointed to a small newspaper clipping that had been attached to the back of the investigator's report. He died in a riding accident 3 months after submitting his final report. His horse apparently stumbled on a familiar trail that he'd ridden hundreds of times before. The territorial authorities declared it an unfortunate accident and closed the case permanently. Nadine felt a chill as she considered the pattern that was emerging from the historical record. Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had disappeared after uncovering evidence of corruption. The investigator hired by their families had died shortly after documenting that corruption. And now, more than a century later, someone was still interested enough in these events to make threatening phone calls to anyone who might possess evidence related to the case. As she carefully photographed the surveyor's map with her phone, Nadine noticed details that hadn't been apparent in her initial examination. Several of the penciled notations on the map corresponded to landmarks that she recognized from her own knowledge of the mountain territory. If Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had indeed hidden evidence of their discoveries, these map notations might provide clues about where that evidence could be found. The realization that she might be able to locate the cache mentioned in Jackson's final journal entry filled Nadine with equal parts excitement and apprehension. On one hand, Finding additional evidence could help her understand the full scope of what the three men had discovered and why someone was still willing to use intimidation to control that information. On the other hand, the historical record suggested that people who got too close to this particular mystery had a tendency to meet unfortunate ends. As Nadine prepared to leave the library, Martha handed her photocopies of the most relevant documents, along with a business card for a historian at the State University who specialized in territorial mining operations. "Be careful, dear," Martha said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate the complexities of historical research. Some stories from the past have a way of reaching into the present, especially when there are still people who have reasons to keep certain secrets buried. The drive back to her cabin took Nadine through the kind of mountain scenery that usually provided comfort and perspective after difficult days. But today, the towering pines and granite outcroppings seemed to hide more shadows than usual, and she found herself checking her mirrors more frequently than the winding road required. The photocopied documents from Martha's research sat on the passenger seat beside her, weighted down by a small stone to prevent them from scattering in the wind from her partially open window. Ranger had remained at the cabin during her library visit, and she could see him watching from the front window as she pulled into her driveway. His alert posture suggested that the morning had not been entirely peaceful in her absence, and when she entered the cabin, his behavior confirmed her suspicions. The dog immediately led her to the kitchen window that overlooked the road, where he positioned himself with the kind of focused attention that indicated ongoing surveillance duties. "What did you see while I was gone, boy?" she asked, scratching behind his ears while scanning the tree line for signs of whatever had caught his attention. The wooden crate still dominated her kitchen table, but now Nadine approached it with the additional knowledge that Martha's research had provided. The hidden compartment that had yielded Jackson's journal might not be the only secret that the carefully crafted container held. Armed with the surveyor's map and the investigator's report, she began a more systematic examination of the crate's construction. The discovery of the mining company's stock certificate came when she noticed that one of the iron bands holding the crate together was slightly looser than the others. What she had initially taken for the settling that comes with age revealed itself to be intentional when she realized that the band could be rotated around the circumference of the crate. When turned to a specific position, the band revealed a narrow slot that had been invisible when the metal was aligned with the wood grain. Inside the slot was a single document, folded carefully and wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. When Nadine unfolded it on her kitchen table, she found herself looking at an ornate stock certificate from the Blackwater Mining Company, dated September 12, 1892, and made out to bearer in the amount of 500 shares. The certificate itself was beautifully engraved, with elaborate scrollwork and official seals that spoke to the legitimacy and prosperity of the company that had issued it. But what made the document particularly interesting was the handwritten notation along one margin: "Payment for Territorial Mining Commissioner. Advance information on independent claims filed 8/15 to 9/15, 1892. This single piece of paper provided concrete evidence for the accusations that Jackson had made in his journal. The Blackwater Mining Company hadn't simply been competing with independent prospectors. Through legitimate business practices, they had been purchasing advance information about claim filings from the territorial official who was supposed to be protecting the interests of all miners equally. But the stock certificate represented more than just evidence of corruption. It was proof that someone had been gathering documentation with the intention of exposing the conspiracy. The careful notation and preservation suggested that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had been building a systematic case against Blackwater and their government collaborators. The question now was whether they had gathered enough evidence to make that case, and if so, where they had hidden it. Nadine spread the surveyor's map on her table next to the stock certificate and began comparing the penciled notations with her own knowledge of the local geography. Several of the marked locations were familiar to her from hiking expeditions with markers, and she began to see a pattern in the way the sites had been selected. Each marked location offered natural protection from observation while providing access to the kind of terrain where mining equipment could be moved without leaving obvious traces. The sound of vehicles on her gravel driveway interrupted her analysis and sent Ranger into the alert position that had become familiar over the past day. But this time, instead of a single dark sedan, Nadine saw two official vehicles with the markings of the county sheriff's department pulling up to her cabin. The sight of law enforcement should have been reassuring, but given what she'd learned about the historical involvement of territorial authorities in the disappearance of the three prospectors, she found herself approaching the front door with considerable caution. Deputy Maria Torres stepped out of the lead vehicle, her uniform crisp and her manner professional in the way that suggested extensive training in community relations. She was younger than Nadine had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from knowing her job and doing it well. The second deputy remained by the vehicles, his attention focused on the surrounding terrain in a way that suggested security concerns rather than casual backup. "Ms. Walker, I'm Deputy Torres with the Sheriff's Department. We've received some reports about unusual activity in this area, and I'd like to ask you a few questions if you have a few minutes." The request was polite and professional, but Nadine noticed that Torres had positioned herself where she could see through the front door into the kitchen, where the wooden crate and scattered documents were clearly visible on the table. The timing of this visit, coming so soon after her research at the library and the threatening phone call from David Chen, seemed too coincidental to be routine community policing. "Of course, Deputy. What kind of unusual activity are we talking about?" "We've had reports of people asking questions around town about historical artifacts and old mining documents. Given the recent increase in theft targeting rural properties, we're trying to stay ahead of any potential problems. I understand you recently purchased some items at a storage auction." The question was direct enough to confirm Nadine's suspicion that this visit was specifically motivated by her acquisition of the wooden crate and its contents. But Torres's manner suggested genuine concern rather than the subtle threats that had characterized her conversation with David Chen. Still, Nadine's library research had taught her to be cautious about trusting official investigations, especially when they involved the same kinds of materials that had apparently gotten Jackson. "Mills and Thornton killed. I did buy a storage unit last week," Nadine confirmed. "Mostly old junk, but there were some historical items that might be interesting to the right collector." Torres nodded, making notes in a small notebook that she pulled from her shirt pocket. "Have you had any contact from people claiming to be collectors or dealers in historical artifacts? Anyone offering to purchase specific items?" The specificity of the question made it clear that law enforcement was already aware of David Chen's activities. This suggested that either Chen's operation was larger than a single phone call, or that other people had received similar contacts and reported them to authorities. Either way, it indicated that Nadine's situation was part of a broader pattern rather than an isolated incident. "I did get a phone call this morning from someone claiming to represent collectors," Nadine said carefully. "He seemed particularly interested in documents and photographs from the mining era." The call felt more like pressure than a genuine business inquiry. Torres looked up from her notebook, her expression shifting to one of more focused attention. "Can you describe this person's approach? Did he make any specific requests or suggestions about how you should handle the items you'd found?" Nadine recounted her conversation with David Chen, noting the way his politeness had carried undertones of threat and his surprisingly specific knowledge about what she had purchased at the auction. Torres listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification about exact phrases or timing. in the way of someone who was building a case rather than simply gathering general information. Miss Walker, I need to tell you that you're not the first person to receive this kind of contact, Torres said when Nadine finished her account. We've had 3 similar reports in the past month, all involving people who'd acquired historical materials through estate sales or auctions. In each case, the person making contact claimed to represent legitimate collectors, but their approach suggested they were more interested in acquiring specific items than in general historical artifacts. This revelation added a new dimension to the situation that Nadine hadn't considered. If David Chen's organization was systematically targeting anyone who acquired historical materials related to territorial mining operations, then the conspiracy that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had uncovered might have implications that extended far beyond a single storage unit or a cache hidden in the mountains. Have any of the other people who were contacted actually sold items to these collectors? Nadine asked. Torres's expression grew somber as she answered. 2 of them did. In both cases, they reported that the buyers paid cash immediately and asked no questions about provenance or authenticity. They also insisted on collecting the items personally rather than arranging for shipping or professional transport. Both sellers described feeling that the transactions were more urgent than normal collector purchases. The pattern suggested a level of organization and resources that went far beyond casual interest in historical artifacts. If Chen's group was willing to pay premium prices for immediate acquisition of territorial mining documents, then they were operating under pressures that made cost and efficiency secondary considerations. In Nadine's experience, that kind of urgency usually indicated that someone was working against a deadline or trying to prevent information from becoming public. Deputy Torres, can I ask if any of these collectors have identified themselves as representing specific organizations or institutions? That's part of what makes this pattern interesting, Torres replied. They all claim to represent different groups: private collectors, historical societies, university research projects. But when we've tried to verify these organizations, we found that they either don't exist or have no knowledge of anyone acting on their behalf to acquire territorial mining documents. The systematic deception suggested a sophisticated operation that was designed to acquire historical materials while avoiding the kind of documentation trail that legitimate collecting would generate. If someone was willing to go to these lengths to control access to information about territorial mining operations, then the materials that Nadine had found represented more than historical curiosity. They represented evidence that someone still considered dangerous enough to suppress. As Torres prepared to leave, she handed Nadine a business card and made a request that confirmed the seriousness of the situation. Ms. Walker, I'd appreciate it if you'd contact me immediately if you receive any more calls or visits from people interested in your auction purchases. We're treating this as a potential conspiracy to acquire stolen property, and your cooperation could be crucial in helping us understand who's behind these activities. The deputy's choice of words, conspiracy, and stolen property suggested that law enforcement had already developed theories about the criminal nature of the collector's activities. But as Nadine watched the sheriff's vehicles disappear down her driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that the deputies were investigating only the surface of something much deeper and more dangerous than artifact theft. The evening light was fading over the mountains when Nadine made the discovery that would change everything she thought she understood about Jackson, Mills, and Thornton's story. She had been examining the wooden crate by lamplight, looking for additional hidden compartments that might contain more evidence, when her fingers encountered something that shouldn't have been there, a small metal object embedded in what appeared to be solid wood. Careful investigation revealed that what she'd found was a tarnished sheriff's badge, deliberately concealed within the crate's construction in a way that suggested it had been placed there as evidence rather than simply hidden for safekeeping. The badge was smaller than modern ones, with the six-pointed star design that had been standard for territorial law enforcement in the 1890s. Engraved across the center were the words, Sheriff, Millbrook County, and below that, a name that made Nadine's heart skip, T. Mills. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Thomas Mills hadn't simply been one of three prospectors who'd stumbled onto a valuable mining claim. He had been the local sheriff, the very person who should have been investigating Blackwater Mining Company's illegal activities rather than documenting them as a private citizen. This revelation recontextualized everything she'd read in Jackson's journal and learned from her research at the library. If Mills had been the sheriff, then his access to territorial government communications would have been far more extensive than Jackson's journal had suggested. He wouldn't have been speculating about corruption. He would have been documenting it from within the system. More importantly, his disappearance would have represented not just the loss of three prospectors, but the elimination of the one law enforcement official who'd been in a position to expose the conspiracy. Nadine sat back in her kitchen chair, trying to process the implications of this discovery while Ranger maintained his vigilant watch by the window. The careful preservation of Mills's badge within the wooden crate suggested that someone had understood its significance as evidence. But who had taken the time to hide it so carefully, and why had they chosen this particular method of preservation? The answer might lie in the final hidden compartment that she discovered when she realized that the badge had been placed in a specially constructed chamber that connected to a larger space within the crate's structure. This compartment, invisible from the outside and accessible only by manipulating the mechanism that had held the badge in place, contained a collection of documents that dwarfed everything she'd found so far. The territorial land deed was the first document she examined, and its implications were immediately clear. Dated August 15, 1892, it established legal ownership of nearly 10,000 acres of mountain territory to Jackson, Mills, and Thornton, partners in prospecting. The acreage described in the deed encompassed not only the mining claims mentioned in Jackson's journal, but also vast stretches of apparently undeveloped land that extended far into the high country. But what made the deed particularly significant was the official seal and signature that validated it. The same territorial mining commissioner whose corruption had been documented in Jackson's journal and proven by the Blackwater stock certificate. The commissioner had signed a legal document establishing the three men's legitimate ownership of the very land that his secret dealings with Blackwater were designed to help the company acquire illegally. The deed provided concrete proof that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton hadn't been naive prospectors who'd stumbled into something beyond their understanding. They had been sophisticated enough to secure legal ownership of their claims through proper territorial channels, while simultaneously gathering evidence of the corruption that threatened those claims. Mills's position as sheriff would have given him the legal authority to investigate Blackwater's activities, while Jackson's expertise in geology and Thornton's practical experience would have provided the technical knowledge needed to evaluate the true value of their discoveries. But the most shocking revelation came in a set of territorial government communications that Mills had apparently copied during his investigation of Blackwater's activities. These documents, bearing official seals and signatures, provided detailed records of payments made to territorial officials in exchange for advance information about mining claims, assistance in filing competing claims, and help in intimidating independent prospectors who refused to sell their properties. One communication, dated September 20, 1892, was particularly damning. It was a memo from the Territorial Governor's Office to the Mining Commissioner, acknowledging receipt of considerations from Blackwater Mining Company and providing specific instructions for handling the Jackson, Mills, Thornton situation. The memo made it clear that territorial authorities were not only aware of Blackwater's illegal activities, but were actively participating in planning the elimination of the three men who threatened to expose the conspiracy. The sheriff's recent inquiries have become too focused and too public, the memo read. His position gives him access to information that could prove embarrassing to territorial administration. Recommend immediate action to resolve this situation before it requires intervention from federal authorities. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was unmistakable. Territorial authorities had decided that Mills' investigation posed an unacceptable threat to their profitable arrangement with Blackwater Mining Company. The memo was essentially a death warrant, issued by the highest levels of territorial government, and dressed in the language of administrative efficiency. Additional documents in the collection provided details about how that death warrant had been carried out. Mills had apparently been tracking Blackwater's activities systematically, documenting not only their illegal claim jumping, but also instances of violence against prospectors who had refused to cooperate. His sheriff's records, copied and preserved in the hidden compartment, detailed a pattern of intimidation and assault that had been systematically ignored by territorial courts. But the most disturbing discovery was a letter written in Mills' careful handwriting and dated October 2, 1892, the day before the final entry in Jackson's journal. The letter was addressed to his mother in Denver and had apparently never been sent, perhaps because Mills hadn't lived long enough to post it. "Dear Mother," the letter began, "I am writing to you because I fear I may not have another opportunity to explain my actions or to say goodbye. Jackson, Thornton, and I have uncovered evidence of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of territorial government. As sheriff, I have a duty to investigate these crimes, but I have come to understand that my investigation has placed us all in mortal danger." The letter went on to detail Mills' growing awareness that his official position, rather than protecting him, had made him a primary target for elimination. He had realized that his communications were being monitored and his activities reported to the same officials he was investigating. The letter suggested that he had already hidden the evidence they had gathered and was preparing to disappear until federal authorities could be contacted to investigate the territorial government's involvement in the conspiracy. "I have reason to believe that we are being watched constantly and that our lives are in immediate danger," Mills wrote. "I have made arrangements to ensure that the evidence of these crimes will survive, even if we do not. If you receive news of my death, please contact federal authorities and tell them that proof of territorial corruption is hidden where only Jackson, Thornton, and I agreed it should be." The letter ended with specific instructions for contacting federal marshals and a coded reference to the location where evidence had been cached. But most significantly, it included a direct statement that contradicted everything Nadine had assumed about the three men's fate. "If we are killed, it will not be by claim jumpers or rival prospectors. It will be by territorial authorities who cannot allow their crimes to be exposed." As Nadine finished reading Mills's final letter, she realized that she was no longer dealing with a historical mystery about three prospectors who had disappeared in the 1890s. She was dealing with evidence of government-sanctioned murder that had been covered up for more than a century. The wooden crate and its contents represented not just historical artifacts, but proof of crimes that someone was apparently still willing to kill to suppress the understanding that her own property sat within the boundaries, described in the territorial land deed, added a personal dimension to the danger she was facing. If Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had indeed hidden additional evidence somewhere in the vast acreage they had legally owned, then that evidence might well be located on or near her own land. The cache mentioned in Jackson's journal and Mills's letter might be within walking distance of her cabin, but more importantly, if territorial authorities had been willing to murder a sheriff and two prospectors in 1892 to protect their conspiracy with Blackwater Mining Company, then the modern representatives of those interests might be equally willing to use violence to prevent that evidence from coming to light. The phone call from David Chen and the visit from Deputy Torres suddenly seemed like preliminary moves in a larger game whose stakes were higher than she had initially understood. The break-in attempt came at 3 o'clock in the morning, announced by Ranger's low growl and the subtle sounds of someone testing the locks on her cabin's doors and windows. Nadine had been lying awake anyway, her mind too active with the implications of Mill's hidden evidence to allow for sleep. But the dog's warning sent adrenaline coursing through her system with the intensity of an electric shock. She rolled out of bed and onto the floor, staying low as she moved toward the window that offered the best view of her cabin's perimeter. The moonlight was enough to reveal two figures moving with the kind of careful stealth that suggested professional training rather than opportunistic burglary. One was working on the back door, while the other maintained a position where he could watch the surrounding terrain for signs of resistance or interference. Ranger had positioned himself between Nadine and the sounds of intrusion, his body language indicating that he was prepared to defend his territory, but waiting for her signal about how to proceed. The dog's military training with Marcus had included protocols for exactly this kind of situation, and Nadine found herself grateful for her late husband's insistence on preparing for contingencies. That had seemed paranoid at the time. The first intruder had apparently succeeded in bypassing her back door lock, because she could hear the subtle creaking of hinges as the door was opened slowly and carefully. The sounds that followed suggested systematic searching rather than random theft, drawers being opened and closed with minimal noise, furniture being moved just enough to check for hidden items, the kind of methodical investigation that indicated specific objectives rather than general larceny. Nadine used the noise of their searching to cover her own movement toward the telephone in her bedroom, but when she lifted the receiver, she discovered that the line had been cut. The intruders had apparently anticipated the possibility that she might try to call for help, which suggested a level of planning and preparation that went far beyond casual burglary. These were people who understood the importance of controlling communication and eliminating variables that might complicate their operation. The realization that she was effectively isolated drove home the seriousness of her situation in a way that phone threats and mysterious surveillance had not. Someone was willing to commit felony breaking and entering to acquire the materials she'd found in the wooden crate, which meant that those materials represented value that justified significant legal risks. More importantly, the professional nature of the intrusion suggested that these weren't desperate criminals acting on impulse. They were part of an organization with resources and expertise. From her position by the bedroom window, Nadine could see that the systematic searching of her cabin was focusing on areas where historical documents might reasonably be stored. The intruders were checking filing cabinets, bookcases, and storage areas with the kind of thoroughness that indicated familiarity with how people typically organize and preserve important papers. But their search pattern also suggested that they didn't know exactly what they were looking for, which meant that whoever had sent them had general rather than specific knowledge about what she'd discovered. The wooden crate and its contents were still on her kitchen table, exactly where she'd left them after her evening of research. But Nadine had had the foresight to photograph all the documents with her phone and to hide the physical originals in a location that wouldn't be obvious to casual searchers. The metal ammo box that Marcus had used for storing important papers was concealed beneath the floorboards of their bedroom closet, protected by a hiding place that had been designed to survive. Much more than routine searching, the intruders spent nearly an hour going through her cabin, with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested professional training in search techniques. She could hear them examining the wooden crate carefully, obviously recognizing its significance, but apparently finding it empty of the materials they'd been sent to acquire. Their frustration was evident in the increasingly aggressive sounds of their searching, but they maintained enough discipline to avoid the kind of destruction that would leave obvious evidence of their presence. When they finally gave up and departed, moving with the same careful stealth they'd used during their approach, Nadine remained motionless for another 30 minutes to ensure that they weren't maintaining surveillance of her cabin. Only when she was confident that they had truly left did she allow herself to move from her hiding position and assess the extent of their intrusion. The damage was minimal but telling. The intruders had been careful to return everything to approximately its original position, but they had left subtle signs of their presence that confirmed the professional nature of their operation. Books had been replaced on shelves in slightly different positions. Desk drawers had been closed with different amounts of pressure. The wooden crate had been examined so thoroughly that microscopic wood shavings were scattered around its base. But most significantly, they had left behind clear evidence that they knew exactly what they were looking for. A small piece of paper, apparently dropped accidentally during their search, bore a handwritten list that included Jackson Journal, territorial documents, and mining commissioner materials. This wasn't a fishing expedition. It was a targeted operation designed to acquire specific historical evidence that someone considered threatening enough to justify breaking and entering. The morning brought Deputy Torres back to Nadine's cabin, this time with a crime scene investigator and a level of official attention that suggested the sheriff's department was taking the break-in seriously. Torres's questions were detailed and professional, focusing on exactly what had been taken and whether Nadine could identify any specific items that the intruders had been seeking. "Nothing appears to be missing," Nadine reported, which was technically true, since the most important documents were safely hidden in Marcus's ammo box. But they definitely went through everything systematically. This wasn't random vandalism or opportunistic theft. Torres examined the dropped paper with the handwritten list, her expression growing increasingly serious as she read the specific items that had been targeted. "Miss Walker, this list suggests that whoever broke in knew exactly what you'd found in that storage unit. The level of detail here indicates inside information about your discoveries." The implication was troubling, but not entirely surprising. If someone had been monitoring the storage auction or tracking her subsequent research activities, they would have had opportunities to learn about the general nature of her discoveries. But the specificity of the list suggested access to information that went beyond casual observation. It suggested someone with detailed knowledge of territorial mining history and the specific documents that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton might have preserved. "Deputy, I need to ask you something that might sound strange," Nadine said, making a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous. "In your research into these artifact collectors, have you found any connections to modern mining or development companies?" Torres looked up from her notebook, her expression shifting to one of sharp attention. "What makes you ask that question?" "Some of the historical documents I've found suggest that the original mining conspiracy in the 1890s involved corruption that reached into territorial government. If similar interests are still active today, they might have reasons to want that historical evidence to remain hidden." The deputy was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much she could share about an ongoing investigation. When she finally responded, her voice carried the kind of careful precision that suggested she was walking a fine line between transparency and confidentiality. "We've identified some interesting patterns in the companies that these collectors claim to represent," Torres said. "Several of them trace back to holding companies that have interests in mountain property development. We're still investigating the connections, but there are definitely modern business interests that seem unusually concerned with historical mining documents." This confirmation of Nadine's suspicions added another layer to the complexity of her situation. If modern development companies had reasons to suppress evidence of historical corruption, then the conspiracy that had killed Jackson, Mills, and Thornton might have evolved rather than simply disappeared. The territorial mining commissioner, who had taken bribes in 1892, might have modern counterparts who were equally willing to use illegal methods to protect profitable arrangements. But as Torres prepared to leave, she made a request that surprised Nadine with its urgency and specificity. "Ms. Walker, I'm going to ask you to consider relocating temporarily while we investigate this situation. The level of organization we're seeing suggests that these people have significant resources and are willing to escalate their activities to achieve their objectives. Your safety might depend on making yourself a more difficult target." The suggestion that she should abandon her home and the evidence she'd discovered felt like capitulation to threats that she was only beginning to understand. But Torres's obvious concern and the professional assessment behind her recommendation made it clear that law enforcement considered the danger to be real and immediate. "I appreciate your concern, Deputy, but this is my home. I'm not ready to let someone drive me away from it based on threats and intimidation." Torres nodded, but her expression suggested that she'd expected this response and had prepared for it. "I understand your position, but I want you to know that we're treating this as a serious criminal conspiracy. If you change your mind about relocating, or if you experience any additional threats or suspicious activity, please contact me immediately. We have resources available to help protect witnesses in situations like this." The use of the word witnesses was telling. Torres clearly believed that Nadine possessed evidence that could be crucial in prosecuting the people behind the systematic acquisition of historical mining documents. But being classified as a witness also meant being classified as a target, with all the implications that carried for her personal safety and freedom of movement. After the deputies left, Nadine spent the rest of the morning studying the surveyor's map and comparing it with her own knowledge of the terrain around her property. The coded references in Mills's final letter provided additional clues about where the three men might have hidden their cache of evidence, and she began to see a pattern in the locations they had marked on their map. Each potential hiding place offered natural protection from the elements while remaining accessible to someone who knew exactly where to look. More importantly, all of them were located within the boundaries of the land that the territorial deed had established as belonging to Jackson, Mills, and Thornton. If their legal ownership had been preserved through some mechanism that survived their deaths, then the cache might still be legally accessible to someone who could establish a legitimate claim to their property. The realization that her own cabin sat squarely within the territory described in the 1892 land deed added a personal dimension to the historical mystery that she hadn't fully considered before. If Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had indeed hidden evidence on what was now her property, then she might have a legal right to recover it that went beyond simple discovery or historical curiosity. But more immediately, the location of her cabin within the original territorial grant might explain why someone was willing to go to such lengths to monitor her activities and acquire the materials she'd found. If the cache contained evidence that could challenge modern property rights or reveal ongoing corruption in land development activities, then its discovery could have financial implications that justified the kind of organized response she was experiencing. As evening approached and Ranger resumed his vigilant watch by the windows, Nadine found herself facing a decision that would determine not only her own safety, but also whether the evidence that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had died to preserve would finally see the light of day. She could follow Deputy Torres's advice and relocate until law enforcement resolved the situation, effectively abandoning the investigation and leaving the historical conspiracy unexposed. Or she could continue her research and attempt to locate the cache, knowing that doing so would almost certainly escalate the danger she was facing. The answer came to her as she looked at the photograph of the three men that had started her entire investigation. Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had faced similar choices in 1892, knowing that their investigation of territorial corruption would put their lives at risk. They had chosen to continue gathering evidence despite the threats, ultimately sacrificing their lives to preserve proof of crimes that had remained hidden for more than a century. Now that proof was within her reach, hidden somewhere in the mountains that surrounded her cabin. waiting for someone with the courage to complete the work that three brave men had started more than 100 years ago. The journey to the cache location began before dawn, with Nadine and Ranger following a trail that wound deep into the high country where few people ventured, even during the best weather. The surveyor's map and Mills coded references had led her to a remote canyon that offered both the natural protection and the accessibility that would have made it ideal for hiding evidence in 1892. The October air was crisp enough to make her breath visible, and the early morning light cast long shadows between the towering pines that had witnessed more than a century of secrets. Ranger's behavior during the hike confirmed that they were following the right path. The dog moved with the kind of focused determination that suggested he was tracking scents that meant something to him, pausing occasionally at specific landmarks that corresponded to notations on the surveyor's map. His military training with Marcus had included search and recovery operations, and Nadine found herself trusting his instincts about the terrain in ways that supplemented her own interpretation of the historical documents. The cache site itself was hidden within a natural rock formation that provided protection from both the elements and casual discovery. A cluster of granite boulders had created a sheltered area that was invisible from most angles, but accessible to someone who knew exactly where to look. The opening was narrow enough to discourage exploration by wildlife, but large enough to allow human access to whatever lay beyond. Inside the rocky shelter, Nadine discovered that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had constructed a more elaborate hiding place than she'd expected. They had built a stone-lined chamber that was designed to protect its contents from moisture, temperature changes, and the kind of natural deterioration that could destroy paper documents over decades of storage. The engineering was sophisticated, enough to suggest that they had planned for long-term preservation rather than temporary concealment. The strong box that sat in the center of the chamber was made of heavy steel and secured with a lock that had survived more than a century of mountain weather. But the key that Nadine had found hidden in a final compartment of the wooden crate fit perfectly, opening with the satisfying click of precision machinery that had been built to last. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved with the same care that had protected the other documents, she found the confession letter that would change everything she thought she understood about the three men's story. The letter was written in Mills' careful handwriting, but the content was unlike anything she'd found in his previous communications. Instead of documenting corruption or planning resistance to Blackwater Mining Company's illegal activities, this final document revealed a truth that was far more complex and morally ambiguous than she'd been prepared to discover. To whoever finds this evidence, the confession began, I write these words knowing that I may be the only one left to tell the truth about what happened to Jackson and Thornton. What I am about to confess will destroy the reputation I have tried to build as an honest lawman. But the weight of my actions has become unbearable, and I cannot face death without acknowledging what I have done. Nadine felt her hands trembling as she continued reading, aware that Ranger had positioned himself at the entrance to the rocky shelter in a way that suggested he sensed the emotional significance of what she was discovering. Jackson and Thornton were good men who trusted me to help them expose the corruption that was destroying honest and prospecting in this territory, Mills continued. They believed that my position as sheriff gave me the authority and the moral obligation to investigate Blackwater's crimes and bring the responsible parties to justice. They were right about my obligations, but they were wrong about my character. The confession went on to detail how Mills had initially supported his partner's investigation of territorial corruption, using his official position to gather evidence and document the systematic crimes that were being committed against independent prospectors. But as their investigation had progressed and the evidence had mounted, Mills had been contacted by territorial authorities who offered him a choice between cooperation and elimination. Governor Harrison's representatives made it clear that my investigation was putting my own life in danger along with the lives of Jackson and Thornton, Mills wrote. They offered me a substantial payment to end the investigation and to ensure that my partners understood the wisdom of relocating to territory where their activities would be less problematic for established business interests. But, according to the confession, Jackson and Thornton had refused to abandon their investigation, despite Mills's warnings about the danger they were facing. They had believed that the evidence they'd gathered was strong enough to expose the corruption through federal authorities, and they had been preparing to travel to Denver to present their case to U.S. Marshals, who could investigate territorial government crimes. I tried to convince them that federal intervention would take months or years to achieve results, and that they would not survive long enough to see justice done, Mills continued. But they were determined to see their work completed, regardless of the personal cost. Jackson had a wife and children who depended on him, but he believed that exposing the corruption was more important than his own safety. Thornton was planning to be married in the spring, but he would not abandon the fight for honest government in our territory. The confession revealed that Mills had been forced to make a choice between betraying his partners and watching all three of them be killed by territorial authorities who were determined to suppress their investigation. In the moment of panic and moral failure, he had chosen a third option that had haunted him for the remaining weeks of his life. On the night of October 2nd, I met Jackson and Thornton at our usual gathering place to discuss our final plans for contacting federal authorities, Mills wrote. I had been carrying my service revolver, as was my habit when traveling in remote areas. But on this night, I carried it with a different purpose. I told my partners that I had received word that federal marshals were already investigating territorial corruption and that our evidence would not be needed. When they expressed skepticism about this convenient development, I realized that they suspected my betrayal. The confession described how the confrontation had escalated when Jackson and Thornton had demanded to see the supposed federal communications that Mills claimed to have received. Unable to produce evidence of federal involvement because none existed, Mills had been faced with the certainty that his partners would realize he had been compromised by territorial authorities. In my panic and shame, I drew my weapon and fired twice before either of them could react, Mills confessed. Jackson died immediately, but Thornton lived long enough to ask me why I had chosen to betray everything we had worked for. I had no answer for him then, and I have no answer now except my own cowardice and my fear of dying for principles that I was not strong enough to defend. Nadine set the confession letter down on the rocky floor of the chamber, her mind reeling from the revelation that the three men she'd come to admire as heroes of historical justice had actually been victims of betrayal by their closest ally. Mills hadn't been a courageous lawman who had died. Investigating corruption, he had been a compromised official who had murdered his partners to protect his own life and position. But the confession contained one more revelation that explained why someone in the present day might still be interested in suppressing this historical evidence. According to Mills's final statements, he had not acted alone in planning the murders of Jackson and Thornton. He had been assisted by family members who had helped him dispose of the bodies and create the false story about the three men's disappearance. My cousin, Deputy Robert Torres, helped me move the bodies to a location where they would never be found, Mills wrote. My sister Margaret provided the alibi that placed me in town on the night of the murders. My nephew James Torres, who works for the Territorial Surveyor's Office, altered the official records to support our story about the three men abandoning their claims to seek opportunities in California. The Torres family name sent a shock through Nadine as she realized the implications of this revelation. Deputy Maria Torres, who had been investigating the modern conspiracy to acquire historical mining documents, was apparently descended from the same family that had helped cover up the original murders in 1892. The professional concern and helpful assistance that Torres had shown might have been motivated by something other than dedication to law. Enforcement, as Nadine carefully folded the confession letter and prepared to leave the cache site, she realized that her situation had become far more complex and dangerous than she'd initially understood. She was no longer dealing with historical mysteries and modern artifact collectors. She was dealing with a family secret that had been protected through multiple generations and was apparently still considered worth killing to preserve. The evidence she now possessed could destroy not only the reputation of a respected law enforcement family, but also challenge property rights and business interests that had been built on crimes committed more than a century ago. If the Torres family had been involved in covering up the original murders, and if they were still involved in suppressing evidence of those crimes, then Deputy Torres's helpful investigation might actually be an attempt to control and limit what Nadine could discover. But most immediately, Nadine realized that she could no longer trust the sheriff's department to protect her from the people who were trying to acquire her historical evidence. If Torres was part of a conspiracy to suppress Mills's confession, then contacting law enforcement for help might actually be the most dangerous thing she could do. The discovery of the actual gold cache came almost by accident. When Rangers' continued investigation of the rocky chamber led him to a section of the stone wall that sounded hollow when scratched. What Nadine had initially taken for solid rock revealed itself to be a carefully constructed false wall that concealed a much larger space behind the document storage area. Inside this hidden chamber, Jackson and Thornton had apparently stored the physical evidence of their mining discoveries. Several pounds of raw gold nuggets and ore samples that represented the tangible wealth that had started the entire conspiracy. The gold itself was beautiful in the way that only natural precious metal could be, with the organic shapes and rich color that spoke of geological processes that had taken millions of years to complete. But more than its beauty or even its monetary value, the gold represented proof that Jackson and Thornton had indeed made the kind of discovery that would have attracted the attention of corrupt territorial officials. This wasn't speculative mining or wishful thinking. It was evidence of a major strike that would have been worth killing for in 1892. But as Nadine examined the cache more carefully, she realized that the gold represented more than just the original motive for the conspiracy. According to the survey maps and territorial documents she'd found, the source of this gold was located on land that was now part of several modern development projects. If the mineral rights that Jackson Mills and Thornton had legally established in 1892 were still valid, then this gold discovery could have implications for current property ownership and development rights. Throughout the region, the journey back to her cabin was complicated by the growing certainty that she was being followed. Rangers' behavior indicated the presence of other people in the mountain terrain, and twice Nadine caught glimpses of movement that suggested organized surveillance rather than casual hiking. The professional nature of the tracking meant that whoever was monitoring her activities had significant resources and training, which aligned with her growing understanding that this conspiracy involved more than historical artifact collection. Back at her cabin, Nadine faced the complex task of deciding what to do with evidence that could expose a century-old murder conspiracy while potentially placing her own life in immediate danger. Deputy Torres had seemed genuinely concerned about her safety, but the revelation that the Torres family had been involved in covering up the original crimes made it impossible to trust law enforcement assistance. At the same time, the people who had broken into her cabin and threatened her over the phone were apparently willing to escalate their activities. To prevent the historical evidence from becoming public, the solution came to her as she considered the original motivation that had driven Jackson and Thornton to continue their investigation, despite the danger they faced. They had believed that exposing the corruption was more important than their personal safety, and they had been willing to sacrifice their lives to ensure that evidence of the crimes would eventually be discovered. Now that she possessed that evidence, she had a moral obligation to ensure that their sacrifice had not been in vain, but she also had an obligation to protect herself and to ensure that the evidence survived even if she didn't. The systematic approach that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had used to document and preserve their discoveries provided a model for how she could ensure that the truth would eventually emerge regardless of what happened to her personally. The first step was creating multiple copies of all the evidence she'd found, storing them in different locations, and ensuring that they would be discovered by appropriate authorities, even if something happened to her. The second step was documenting her own investigation and the modern conspiracy that had emerged in response to her discoveries. If she disappeared under mysterious circumstances, the pattern of threats and surveillance she'd experienced would provide context for understanding why someone had wanted her eliminated. The third step was the most difficult and dangerous, arranging for the evidence to be delivered to federal authorities who could investigate both the historical crimes and the modern conspiracy to suppress evidence of those crimes. But this step required her to identify trustworthy contacts who could act on her behalf without becoming targets themselves. The answer came from an unexpected source. The historian at the State University whom Martha Kellerman had recommended turned out to be Dr. James Whitfield, a specialist in territorial government corruption who had spent decades researching exactly the kinds of crimes that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had uncovered. When Nadine contacted him to arrange a meeting, his immediate interest and detailed knowledge of the historical context suggested that he was both qualified to evaluate her evidence and motivated to see justice done. Dr. Whitfield's office at the university provided a neutral location where they could examine the evidence together without the surveillance that had complicated her activities in the mountains. His reaction to Mills' confession and the supporting documents confirmed the significance of what she'd discovered while providing professional validation for conclusions she'd reached through her own research. Ms. Walker, what you found represents the most complete documentation of territorial government corruption that I've seen in 30 years of research, Dr. Whitfield told her as he carefully examined the various documents. The confession letter alone is historically unprecedented, but the supporting evidence transforms it from a single person's account into a systematic exposé of institutional corruption. But more importantly, Dr. Whitfield was able to provide context for understanding why modern interests might still be concerned about the exposure of these historical crimes. His research had revealed patterns of property ownership and business development that could be traced back to the illegal acquisitions of the 1890s, suggesting that substantial modern wealth had been built on foundations of historical crime. Several of the state's largest development companies can trace their land holdings back to properties that were acquired by Blackwater Mining Company during the territorial period, he explained. If the legal ownership established by Jackson, Mills, and Thornton could be proven to have survived their deaths, it could challenge property rights that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars today. This revelation provided a clear motive for the modern conspiracy that Nadine had encountered. If the evidence she'd found could be used to challenge current property ownership, then the people who stood to lose from such challenges would have powerful incentives to prevent that evidence from becoming public. The systematic acquisition of historical mining documents that Deputy Torres had described wasn't just academic curiosity. It was a defensive strategy designed to control information that could threaten massive financial interests. Dr. Whitfield's connections with federal law enforcement agencies provided the solution to Nadine's dilemma about how to ensure that the evidence reached appropriate authorities. He had worked with FBI specialists in historical crimes and could arrange for the documents to be examined by investigators who had both the expertise and the independence necessary to pursue the case regardless of local political pressures. But as they made plans for transferring the evidence to federal custody, Dr. Whitfield raised a concern that Nadine hadn't fully considered. If the modern conspiracy included people with law enforcement connections, as suggested by the Torres family's involvement, then federal investigation might trigger immediate attempts to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence before prosecution could proceed. Ms. Walker, I need you to understand that once we involve federal authorities, the people behind this conspiracy will know that their activities have been exposed, he warned. They may respond by escalating their efforts to suppress evidence and eliminate witnesses. Your safety will depend on federal authorities' ability to provide protection, and that protection may not be immediately available, the warning forced Nadine to confront the reality that completing Jackson and Thornton's work might require her to accept the same kinds of risks that had ultimately cost them their lives. But as she considered the gold nuggets that represented their discovery and the confession letter that revealed the truth about their deaths, she realized that backing down now would mean allowing their sacrifice to remain meaningless for another century, the final preparations for her confrontation with the conspiracy involved arrangements that reminded her of the precautions that Jackson, Mills, and Thornton had taken in 1892. She created detailed documentation of everything she'd discovered, storing copies in multiple secure locations and providing Dr. Whitfield with instructions for accessing the evidence if something happened to her. She also prepared a comprehensive account of the modern threats and surveillance she'd experienced, creating a record that would help federal investigators understand the current scope of the conspiracy. But most importantly, she made peace with the possibility that exposing the truth might cost her life, just as it had cost the lives of Jackson and Thornton more than a century earlier. The gold that they had discovered and the corruption they had exposed were both still present in the mountains around her cabin, waiting for someone with the courage to complete the work they had started. As evening approached and Ranger took up his familiar position by the window, Nadine realized that tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would determine whether a century of injustice would finally be addressed, or whether the conspiracy that had killed 3 men in 1892 would successfully eliminate the evidence of their crimes once again. The confrontation began at the Mills family cemetery, a small collection of weathered headstones on a hill overlooking the valley where Millbrook had grown from territorial outpost to modern mountain community. Nadine had chosen this location deliberately, knowing that the symbolic weight of the place would add gravity to the revelations she was about to make. Deputy Torres had agreed to meet her there after receiving a carefully worded message that suggested new evidence had emerged about the historical mining conspiracy. Torres arrived alone, as Nadine had requested, but her body language suggested wariness that went beyond normal law enforcement caution. The deputy positioned herself where she could observe the surrounding terrain while maintaining visual contact with Nadine, a tactical arrangement that suggested she was expecting complications beyond a simple conversation about historical documents. You said you had new information about the Jackson, Mills, Thornton case, Torres said, her voice carrying the professional neutrality that had characterized all their previous interactions. What have you discovered? Nadine pulled Mills' service revolver from her jacket pocket, watching as Torres's expression shifted from curiosity to recognition to something approaching panic. The weapon was old but well preserved, its metal surfaces bearing the patina of age, but none of the rust or corrosion that would have resulted from decades of neglect. Most importantly, it bore clear evidence of having been fired, with residue patterns that suggested recent use, despite its historical vintage. I found this in the cache that Sheriff Mills described in his final letter, Nadine said, setting the revolver on the stone wall that bordered the cemetery. Along with his confession to murdering Jackson and Thornton in October 1892, Torres stared at the weapon for a long moment before responding, her silence suggesting that she was processing implications that went far beyond historical curiosity. When she finally spoke, Her voice carried a weight of resignation that confirmed Nadine's suspicions about the deputy's connection to the original conspiracy. My great-great-grandfather was Robert Torres, the deputy who helped Mills cover up the murders, Torres said, her professional composure cracking as she confronted the family secret that had apparently shaped her entire life. I've known the truth about what happened in 1892 since I was old enough to understand why certain topics were never discussed in our family. The admission confirmed the multi-generational nature of the conspiracy while revealing the personal cost that maintaining the secret had imposed on Torres and her family. The deputy's dedication to law enforcement had apparently been motivated by a desire to atone for her ancestors' crimes. But her family loyalty had prevented her from taking action that would expose the truth about the murders. My family has spent more than a century trying to protect Robert Torres's reputation and maintain the fiction that Mills was an honest sheriff who died. Investigating corruption, Torres continued. We've donated money to historical societies, influenced the placement of memorial plaques, and worked to ensure that the official account of events remained unchallenged. But Torres's revelation went beyond simple historical revisionism. Her family's efforts to control the narrative about the 1892 murders had evolved into an active conspiracy to suppress any evidence that might challenge their carefully constructed version of events. The systematic acquisition of territorial mining documents that had brought Nadine to law enforcement attention was actually a Torres family operation, designed to identify and eliminate any materials that might contradict their preferred historical account. The collectors who have been contacting people about historical artifacts are working for my family, Torres admitted. We've been trying to acquire anything that might be related to the Jackson Mills Thornton case before it could be examined by serious historians or used to challenge the memorial that honors Mills as a heroic lawman. The scope of the Torres family's activities explained the professional nature of the surveillance and intimidation that Nadine had experienced. With law enforcement connections spanning multiple generations, they had access to resources and expertise that went far beyond what civilian historical enthusiasts could muster. The break-in at her cabin, the threatening phone calls, and the systematic monitoring of her activities had all been components of an organized effort to prevent the truth about the 1892 murders from becoming public. But as Torres continued her confession, it became clear that the family's motives extended beyond simple historical reputation management. The murders had been covered up not just to protect Robert Torres's career, but to preserve property rights and business interests that had been built on the illegal acquisition of Jackson, Mills, and Thornton's mining claims. When Mills killed his partners, my family helped ensure that their claims were transferred to Blackwater Mining Company as planned, Torres explained. Robert Torres used his position as deputy to file the paperwork that declared the three men legally dead and transferred their property rights to territorial authorities for redistribution. My family received substantial payments for facilitating these transfers, and those payments became the foundation for everything we've achieved over the past century. The revelation that the Torres family had profited directly from the murders added a financial motive to their efforts to suppress evidence of the crimes. If Mills's confession became public and if the illegal nature of the property transfers could be proven, then the Torres family's wealth and position could be challenged by the legitimate heirs of Jackson and Thornton. But Torres's most shocking revelation came when she pulled her own service weapon and pointed it at Nadine with the steady grip of someone who had made peace with what she was about to do. I'm sorry, Miss Walker, but I can't allow you to destroy everything my family has built to atone for Robert Torres's involvement in those murders, Torres said, her voice carrying the same resigned determination that had characterized Mill's final letter. We've used the wealth from those illegal property transfers to fund scholarships, support community development, and make amends for historical injustices in ways that have helped thousands of people over the years. The deputy's justification for continuing the cover-up revealed the moral complexity that had apparently tormented multiple generations of the Torres family. They had used proceeds from historical crimes to fund charitable activities and community improvement, creating a situation where exposing the truth would harm people who had benefited from their generosity while providing justice for victims who had been dead for more than a century. My family has been living with the guilt of Robert Torres's actions for 5 generations, Torres continued. We've tried to balance the scales by using our position and resources to serve the community and help people who need assistance. Exposing the truth now would destroy all of that positive work and create more victims of these historical crimes. But as Torres struggled with the weight of her family's history and the immediate decision about what to do with Nadine, her conflicted emotions became evident in the trembling of her weapon hand and the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. The professional law enforcement officer who had spent her career pursuing justice was being asked to commit murder to protect a family secret, recreating the same moral crisis that had destroyed Mills in 1892. Deputy Torres, you don't have to repeat your ancestors' mistakes, Nadine said, recognizing the deputy's internal struggle and appealing to the principles that had drawn her to law enforcement. There's a difference between honoring your family's attempts to atone for historical crimes and perpetuating those crimes by committing new ones. The confrontation had reached the moment where Torres would have to choose between family loyalty and professional integrity, between protecting a century-old secret and accepting responsibility for the truth. As the afternoon light cast long shadows across the cemetery, where the Torres family's secrets were buried alongside their ancestors, both women understood that the next few minutes would determine whether the conspiracy that had killed Jackson, Mills, and Thornton would finally end, or whether it would claim new victims in its struggle to survive. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the tension that had settled over the cemetery like a weight, and Torres's weapon wavered as she realized that their confrontation was no longer private. Dr. Whitfield's arrival with 2 federal agents represented the culmination of the careful planning that Nadine had undertaken to ensure that the truth would emerge regardless of what happened to her. Personally, Deputy Torres, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Historical Crimes Unit. Dr. Whitfield called out as the federal agents positioned themselves where they could observe the situation without escalating the immediate danger. We're here to discuss the evidence that Ms. Walker has provided regarding the 1892 murders of Jackson and Thornton. The presence of federal law enforcement transformed the dynamic of the confrontation in ways that made Torres's position untenable. She could no longer simply eliminate Nadine and hope that the evidence would disappear with her, because federal authorities were now aware of the case and had independent access to the materials she'd discovered. At the same time, her family's century-long conspiracy could no longer be maintained through threats and intimidation because the evidence was now in the hands of investigators who couldn't be influenced by local political pressure. Agent Chen, I think there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of this case, Torres said, lowering her weapon but maintaining her position between Nadine and the approaching federal agents. We're dealing with historical materials that may not be authentic, and Ms. Walker's interpretation of events may be influenced by her personal investment in creating a dramatic narrative, but Agent Chen's response made it clear that federal authorities had already conducted sufficient investigation to understand the scope and seriousness of the conspiracy that Torres represented. Deputy Torres, we've spent the past week examining the documents that Dr. Whitfield provided, and we've conducted independent research into the Torres family's business activities over the past century, Chen said. We're not here to discuss historical interpretation, we're here to investigate ongoing criminal conspiracy to suppress evidence. of murder and to acquire property through fraudulent means. The agent's matter-of-fact tone and specific knowledge of the Torres family's activities made it clear that Nadine's decision to involve federal authorities had been successful in ways that went beyond simply preserving the historical evidence. The FBI had apparently recognized the modern implications of the century-old conspiracy and had begun treating it as an active criminal case rather than a historical curiosity. Torres's reaction to this revelation was a physical collapse that suggested the weight of maintaining her family's secret had been crushing her for years. She sank onto one of the cemetery's stone benches and buried her face in her hands, her professional composure finally giving way to the emotional exhaustion that had been building throughout her career in law enforcement. My family never wanted anyone else to get hurt, she said through her tears. We just wanted to protect the positive things that Robert Torres's children and grandchildren built with the money from those illegal property transfers. The scholarships, the community centers, the assistance programs, all of that was our way of trying to balance the scales for what our ancestor did. Dr. Whitfield approached Torres with the kind of gentle concern that suggested he understood the human cost of historical secrets while recognizing the importance of exposing the truth about past crimes. Deputy Torres, your family's charitable work has been admirable, but it can't erase the original crimes or justify continuing to suppress evidence of murder, he said. There's a difference between making amends for historical injustices and perpetuating those injustices by covering up the truth about what happened. Agent Chen's investigation had revealed that the Torres family's conspiracy extended far beyond simple historical revisionism. Their systematic acquisition of territorial mining documents had been part of a broader effort to control information that could challenge property rights throughout the region, affecting not only their own holdings, but also those of other families and businesses whose wealth could be traced back to the illegal activities of the 1890s. We've identified at least 12 major development projects that are built on land that was illegally transferred from Jackson and Thornton's original claims, Chen explained. The legal implications of proving those transfers were fraudulent could affect hundreds of millions of dollars in current property values and development rights. But the federal investigation had also revealed something that provided hope for resolving the situation without destroying the positive work that the Torres family had accomplished over the generations. Jackson and Thornton had both died without direct heirs, and their estates had never been properly settled due to the fraudulent declaration of their deaths. This meant that their property rights had essentially remained in legal limbo for more than a century, creating an opportunity for the state to acquire the properties and use them for public benefit. We're proposing a settlement that would acknowledge the historical crimes while preserving the community benefits that the Torres family has created, Agent Chen continued. The state would acquire the disputed properties and establish a foundation that would continue funding the charitable programs that your family has supported, while also providing proper recognition for Jackson and Thornton as victims of murder rather than men who abandoned their claims. The proposal represented a way forward that would expose the truth about the 1892 murders while protecting the innocent people who had benefited from the Torres family's charitable work. More importantly, it would ensure that Jackson and Thornton's sacrifice would finally be recognized and honored, rather than hidden behind a century of lies and cover-ups. Torres looked up from her hands, her expression showing the relief of someone who had finally been released from a burden that had been crushing her family for generations. Agent Chen, my family will cooperate fully with your investigation, she said. We have documents and records that go back to Robert Torres's original involvement in the cover-up. We've kept everything because we never stopped feeling guilty about what our ancestor did. As the afternoon light faded over the cemetery where the confrontation had taken place, Nadine realized that the confrontation had ended not with violence and tragedy, as it had in 1892, but with acknowledgement and healing. The Torres family's century of guilt and secrecy could finally end, while Jackson and Thornton's story could finally be told with the respect and recognition they deserved. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the Mills family cemetery, and the mountain community of Millbrook had begun the process of coming to terms with the truth about its history. The memorial park that now occupied the site where Jackson and Thornton had made their original gold discovery served as a testament to the power of honesty to heal wounds that had festered for more than a century. Nadine stood at the edge of the park on a crisp January morning, watching as workers installed the final bronze plaque that would tell the complete story of the 3 men whose lives had intersected so tragically. In 1892, the inscription honored Jackson and Thornton as honest prospectors who had died, defending the principles of fair play and honest government, while acknowledging Mills as a man whose moral failure had cost him everything he valued most. Ranger lay at her feet, his attention focused on the workers, but his relaxed posture indicating that he no longer sensed the danger and tension that had characterized their lives during the weeks of investigation and confrontation. The dog's contentment reflected the peace that had settled over the community as the truth about the historical conspiracy had finally been acknowledged and addressed. The bronze memorial itself was beautiful in its simplicity, featuring relief sculptures of the 3 men as they appeared in the photograph that had started Nadine's entire investigation. But unlike monuments that typically celebrated unambiguous heroism, this memorial told a more complex story about human nature and the consequences of moral choices. The inscription acknowledged that even good people could make terrible decisions under pressure, while emphasizing that the truth about those decisions was essential for understanding how to avoid repeating historical mistakes. Deputy Torres, now Sheriff Torres, having been promoted after her cooperation with the federal investigation, approached across the park with the measured stride of someone who had found peace with her family's history and her own role in addressing it. The promotion had been controversial among some community members who felt that her family's involvement in the conspiracy should have disqualified her from law enforcement leadership. But others had recognized that her willingness to expose the truth demonstrated the kind of integrity that was essential for honest governance. "The memorial looks perfect," Torres said, settling onto the bench beside Nadine, where they could observe the final preparations together. "I think Jackson and Thornton would approve of how their story is being told. The federal investigation had resulted in a settlement that had satisfied most of the community's concerns about justice and fairness. The Torres family had agreed to transfer ownership of the disputed properties to a state-managed trust that would use the land for public benefit while continuing to fund the charitable programs that had been supported by the family's wealth. More importantly, the settlement had established a scholarship program specifically designed to support students studying ethics in government and law enforcement, ensuring that the lessons of the 1892 conspiracy would be passed on to future generations. The gold that Jackson and Thornton had discovered had been acquired by the state as part of the settlement, with proceeds from its sale used to establish the memorial park and fund ongoing historical research into territorial government corruption. The mining claims that had started the entire conspiracy had been converted to public lands that would be protected from development while remaining accessible to people interested in learning about the region's complex history. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the Mills family cemetery, and the mountain community of Millbrook had begun the process of coming to terms with the truth about its history. The memorial park that now occupied the site where Jackson and Thornton had made their original gold discovery served as a testament to the power of honesty to heal wounds that had festered for more than a century. Nadine stood at the edge of the park on a crisp January morning, watching as workers installed the final bronze plaque that would tell the complete story of the three men whose lives had intersected so tragically. In 1892, the inscription honored Jackson and Thornton as honest prospectors who had died, defending the principles of fair play and honest government, while acknowledging Mills as a man whose moral failure had cost him everything he valued most. Ranger lay at her feet, his attention focused on the workers, but his relaxed posture indicating that he no longer sensed the danger and tension that had characterized their lives during the weeks of investigation and confrontation. The dog's contentment reflected the peace that had settled over the community as the truth about the historical conspiracy had finally been acknowledged and addressed. The bronze memorial itself was beautiful in its simplicity, featuring relief sculptures of the three men as they appeared in the photograph that had started Nadine's entire investigation. But unlike monuments that typically celebrated unambiguous heroism, this memorial told a more complex story about human nature and the consequences of moral choices. The inscription acknowledged that even good people could make terrible decisions under pressure, while emphasizing that the truth about those decisions was essential for understanding how to avoid repeating historical mistakes. Deputy Torres, now Sheriff Torres, having been promoted after her cooperation with the federal investigation, approached across the park with the measured stride of someone who had found peace with her family's history and her own role in addressing it. The promotion had been controversial among some community members who felt that her family's involvement in the conspiracy should have disqualified her from law enforcement leadership. But others had recognized that her willingness to expose the truth demonstrated the kind of integrity that was essential for honest governance. "The memorial looks perfect," Torres said, settling onto the bench beside Nadine, where they could observe the final preparations together. "I think Jackson and Thornton would approve of how their story is being told. The federal investigation had resulted in a settlement that had satisfied most of the community's concerns about justice and fairness. The Torres family had agreed to transfer ownership of the disputed properties to a state-managed trust that would use the land for public benefit while continuing to fund the charitable programs that had been supported by the family's wealth. More importantly, the settlement had established a scholarship program specifically designed to support students studying ethics in government and law enforcement, ensuring that the lessons of the 1892 conspiracy would be passed on to future generations. The gold that Jackson and Thornton had discovered had been acquired by the state as part of the settlement, with proceeds from its sale used to establish the Memorial Park and fund ongoing historical research into territorial government corruption. The mining claims that had started the entire conspiracy had been converted to public lands that would be protected from development while remaining accessible to people interested in learning about the region's complex history. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the Mills family cemetery, and the mountain community of Millbrook had begun the process of coming to terms with the truth about its history. The memorial park that now occupied the site where Jackson and Thornton had made their original gold discovery served as a testament to the power of honesty to heal wounds that had festered for more than a century. Nadine stood at the edge of the park on a crisp January morning, watching as workers installed the final bronze plaque that would tell the complete story of the three men whose lives had intersected so tragically. In 1892, the inscription honored Jackson and Thornton as honest prospectors who had died, defending the principles of fair play and honest government, while acknowledging Mills as a man whose moral failure had cost him everything he valued most. Ranger lay at her feet, his attention focused on the workers, but his relaxed posture indicating that he no longer sensed the danger and tension that had characterized their lives during the weeks of investigation and confrontation. The dog's contentment reflected the peace that had settled over the community as the truth about the historical conspiracy had finally been acknowledged and addressed. The bronze memorial itself was beautiful in its simplicity, featuring relief sculptures of the three men as they appeared in the photograph that had started Nadine's entire investigation. But unlike monuments that typically celebrated unambiguous heroism, this memorial told a more complex story about human nature and the consequences of moral choices. The inscription acknowledged that even good people could make terrible decisions under pressure, while emphasizing that the truth about those decisions was essential for understanding how to avoid repeating historical mistakes. Deputy Torres, now Sheriff Torres, having been promoted after her cooperation with the federal investigation, approached across the park with the measured stride of someone who had found peace with her family's history and her own role in addressing it. The promotion had been controversial among some community members who felt that her family's involvement in the conspiracy should have disqualified her from law enforcement leadership. But others had recognized that her willingness to expose the truth demonstrated the kind of integrity that was essential for honest governance. "The memorial looks perfect," Torres said, settling onto the bench beside Nadine, where they could observe the final preparations together. "I think Jackson and Thornton would approve of how their story is being told. The federal investigation had resulted in a settlement that had satisfied most of the community's concerns about justice and fairness. The Torres family had agreed to transfer ownership of the disputed properties to a state-managed trust that would use the land for public benefit while continuing to fund the charitable programs that had been supported by the family's wealth. More importantly, the settlement had established a scholarship program specifically designed to support students studying ethics in government and law enforcement, ensuring that the lessons of the 1892 conspiracy would be passed on to future generations. The gold that Jackson and Thornton had discovered had been acquired by the state as part of the settlement, with proceeds from its sale used to establish the Memorial Park and fund ongoing historical research into territorial government corruption. The mining claims that had started the entire conspiracy had been converted to public lands that would be protected from development while remaining accessible to people interested in learning about the region's complex history. But perhaps most importantly, the resolution had provided closure for the families of Jackson and Thornton, whose descendants had finally learned the truth about their ancestors' fate. The federal investigation had located family members in Denver and California who had spent more than a century wondering what had happened to their prospector relatives. The memorial service that had been held in November had brought together 5 generations of family members who had finally been able to properly mourn their ancestors and celebrate their courage. Nadine's own life had been transformed by her experience with the storage unit and its secrets, but not in ways she had expected when she'd first placed that $10 bid. The investigation had revealed her talent for historical research and her courage in the face of danger, leading to an offer from Dr. Whitfield to join his research team at the State University. But she had declined the opportunity to leave the mountains, choosing instead to establish a local historical research center that would help other families investigate their own connections to territorial history. The wooden crate that had started everything now sat in a place of honor in her cabin. But it was no longer a container of secrets. Instead, it served as a reminder that the most important discoveries often came from paying attention to things that others overlooked. The careful craftsmanship that had preserved Jackson's journal and Mill's confession for more than a century had become a symbol of the importance of protecting truth for future generations. "You know, Miss Walker, I've been thinking about what my great-great-grandfather Robert Torres might have done differently if he'd had more courage in 1892, Torres said, watching as the final touches were put on the memorial installation. "I think he knew that helping Mills cover up those murders was wrong, but he didn't have the strength to stand up to family pressure and do what was right." Nadine nodded, understanding the weight of historical reflection that Torres carried. The deputy's willingness to expose her family's secrets and accept the consequences had required exactly the kind of moral courage that Robert Torres had lacked in 1892 in choosing truth over family loyalty. Torres had broken a cycle of deception that had lasted for more than a century. Sometimes, the most important thing we can do is learn from our ancestors' mistakes and make different choices. When we face similar situations, Nadine replied, your great-great-grandfather made the wrong choice, but you made the right one. That's what matters for the future. The completion of the memorial marked the end of one chapter in the community's history, but Nadine knew that it also represented the beginning of something new. The storage unit that had contained Jackson's journal and Mill's confession had been just one of hundreds that were sold at auctions throughout the region every year. Each one represented the possessions of someone whose life had ended or changed dramatically enough to require the disposal of accumulated memories and treasures. Her new role as the community's unofficial historical investigator had already brought her several cases that involved families seeking to understand their connections to territorial history. Some were simple genealogical questions that could be answered through library research and public records. Others were more complex mysteries that required the kind of detective work that had led her to the truth about Jackson, Mills and Thornton, but all of them shared the common theme that had drawn her to the storage unit auction. In the first place, the understanding that the things other people discarded often contained the most important stories. The wooden crate and its contents had taught her that historical truth was often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and courage to look beyond surface appearances and ask the right questions. As the afternoon light began to fade over the memorial park, and Ranger stirred from his comfortable position beside the bench, Nadine reflected on how much her understanding of treasure had changed over the past few months. The $10 she'd spent on Lot 17 had led to discoveries that were worth far more than gold, revealing truths that had the power to heal old wounds and prevent new injustices. The storage unit had contained many treasures, but the most valuable one hadn't been the gold nuggets or even the historical documents. It had been the reminder that every person's story mattered, and that the courage to seek truth and demand justice could make a difference even across the span of centuries. Standing up to leave the memorial park as the workers completed their final tasks, Nadine realized that her new understanding of treasure would guide her future investigations and her continuing work to help families understand their place in the complex history of the American West. The wooden crate had given her more than historical artifacts. It had given her a mission to ensure that important stories were preserved and honored rather than buried and forgotten. As she and Ranger walked back toward her cabin through the gathering dusk, Nadine smiled at the thought that there were probably other storage units waiting to tell their stories to someone with the patience to listen and the courage to seek truth regardless of where it might lead.